who was an NBA legend, and please feel free to throw out multiple of these guys, but who you think their ability is misunderstood in some way by the average NBA fan?
Well, I could just say every defensive player in NBA history. The first guy that comes to my mind when I hear the word misunderstood is prime Draymond Green.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Like, just absurd. But I want to go further back for this type of discussion because history has no bounds. I think the first
Polarizing. Give me the Polarizing take.
The Polarizing. The first guy that came to mind is Nate Thurmond.
Ooh.
Probably the most physically imposing defensive player ever. Like, you look at pictures of this dude, he looked like he, ate LeBron. Yeah. He's, 7 feet tall. And you look at Wilt and Kareem's playoff numbers during that time, it's like, every time they faced Nate Thurmond, it was like kryptonite. Yeah. And I think that's super cool. I also like guys who, their skill sets were, I don't know if I would say outliers, but, ahead of their time, so they kind of, their value was really misunderstood, what was it, 2-time All-Star Reggie Miller, who should have been 8-time All-NBA. Because they just didn't understand how to gauge his value back then. They didn't know what gravity was. They didn't know movement shooting was king. I think a lot of those guys that just precede their era, like Bill Walton with the playmaking, he was the first guy to really have that centric offense, guy in the middle of the floor looking for cutters. That was something that previously wasn't much of a thing. I just think there's so many guys that foreshadowed where basketball was heading offensively in the era we're in now. Like the Jokic, the high dribble handoff, that started with Walton. The shooting bigs, you have guys from the 80s who could shoot as a big, but it was frowned upon. And I just think it's guys who foreshadowed the current era that got really misunderstood during time.
I think you bring up a bunch of great names. Number one is Draymond Green for any of these discussions for me, dude. He is the poster boy of, you know what, man? That's a good litmus test for any NBA fan. It's tell me what you think of Draymond Green, and then I can tell you if we're going to be able to have an intelligent basketball conversation. It's Draymond just, he's either underappreciated or you think he's overrated, and there's no in between. He's such a polarizing player. The first guy that I think of outside of that, you talk about guys ahead of their time. I think of 2 point guards. One of my favorite players, Pistol Pete Maravich. The fact that you just think about his skill set, 40 points in college, right? And I just think about how he would look in a spread out offense. He was such a creative passer, such a great dribbler, could shoot from 30 feet, right? In this era of basketball, I just think he's a guy that in a spread out offense with a bunch of shooters running high pick and roll, Pete would be really deadly. And the fact that the dribbling rules are different, right? Come on, man, you're letting Pete put that thing in his pocket every possession. He's doing some crazy things. I think Steve Nash was ahead of his time, and I think because he never got a ring, I think he can get really underrated. He is doing pinnacle point guard stuff, and because his numbers aren't gaudy, because his scoring numbers aren't 25 a night, I think he can get underrated. And then the other two guys, I mean this in a completely negative light. I think Karl Malone gets really overrated in terms of, he's getting force-fed the ball by one of the greatest point guards of all time. And, shout out what he did on the court. I think he can get overrated. He always fell short in the playoffs. And then the other guy that I point to, I mean this in a positive light, Moses Malone. In terms of the era that he played in, he's not a great offensive hub. He's not a great offensive scorer, but it's when the game is so interior-centric and he is just a big body that could rebound the hell out of the ball, that could anchor the interior. And he's not an all-time great defender. I think there's a lot more better defenders historically than Moses. But when the game is so interior-based and you just have a guy whose skill set is, I am going to grab every freaking rebound and there's nothing you can do about it. I am going to create X amount of extra possessions for my team every game. It's just an invaluable skill set in that era, right? In this era, it's probably disgusting that he's going to grab 20 boards a night. You know what I mean?
Andre Drummond.
Yeah, I think he can get underrated. I don't know. It kind of depends on your viewpoint. I think in some viewpoints he's underrated. I think in others he's overrated. But it's misunderstood is the word, and I think Moses fits that bill.
Moses is interesting. I actually think you kind of hit the nail on the head there, Logan. To the average NBA fan, maybe he's underrated. I would argue to the average NBA person informed enough on history to like make a list of all-time players, he's overrated, because I think people look at the accolades and they look at the 83 run specifically and they can overlook like, okay, this is a big who wasn't like an elite defensive anchor. He was a good defensive big who really could be a black hole, like really a limited playmaker compared to the other all-time greats. Like there's gaps between him and some of the other dudes who he gets lumped into conversations with. But you guys threw out so many of the names on my list that like I barely have anybody left. Draymond is always going to be number one for me. The number of people who think that Draymond is like actual trash, it's disgusting, because basketball fans have this hyperfixation with one-on-one scoring skill. That's a big reason you have people who say Kobe is the GOAT, because you've never seen a combination of balance and footwork and the number of counters and difficult shot making that Kobe Bryant had. That's why you have a whole bunch of people who stan Melo. I upset all of New York when I said Melo was the most overrated player ever, but it's like, Melo's tough as hell, bro. I get it. He's a tough-ass bucket. But there are dudes who can exceed that winning impact with all the other things they do. Draymond is like the epitome of that. Like, how do people even rationalize with themselves that Draymond is overrated when two of the Warriors title teams, they had the number one defense in the league? Like, how'd that happen? That just happened? That didn't happen because of maybe like the greatest combination of perimeter defense and rim protection that we've seen from a guy who also makes the whole offense go with his playmaking. You see it now since he's come back, right? Everything he does, dictating the split actions, everything that happens off ball is unlocked by Draymond's playmaking. You mentioned, Tyler, the short rolling. It just upsets me, the discourse around him. Nash, it'll always baffle me how people, when it comes to Magic, can look at him and understand not a high volume scorer, but crazy efficiency, all-time playmaker, so he just churned out number one offenses. That guy is GOAT tier, top 5 all time. Steve Nash, who checks all those same boxes, and I'm not saying Nash is as good as Magic, he's not. But again, not a super high volume scorer, but crazy efficiency, still devastated defenses. For Magic, it was more with like his mismatch attacking at his size and skill. With Nash, it's just about the unbelievable pull-up shooting. Led 7 number one offenses in 9 years, led the number 2 offense when Amari was hurt in 2006, and it's just the fact that he doesn't have a ring. That's it. Neither of these guys are bringing two-way value. He's like the most fraudulent MVP ever because of that. It was Kobe's MVP. That stuff always pisses me off. Reggie's a great call. Reggie being a 5-time All-Star, 3-time All-NBA, like always just sells him short. And I think he's another guy who, like, some people, it's so interesting, your development of understanding of basketball, I think, because you hear about like the mythology of a Reggie Miller, the big moments. And then if you're a young guy, right, if you're 13 or whatever, and you're me and you love Basketball Reference, you look at the accolades and you think, wait, this guy's overrated. He's only 3-time All-NBA. And then you reach the next level of understanding where you're like, oh no, actually he had an impact on the game that these accolades didn't capture at the time. I think Ray Allen also is a guy who we point to Reggie first. Ray was the centerpiece of a bunch of top 5 offenses throughout Milwaukee and Seattle, and I think has not all of the off-ball value of Reggie, but a lot of it, with a little bit more ability to put the ball on the floor and a little bit more athleticism as a scorer as well. I love the Thurman shout out. These are a bunch of great calls. I think Rick Barry at times gets underrated. Again, you talk about dudes who are ahead of their time. A playmaking forward like that, very much ahead of his time, and obviously a lethal all-time scorer. And it's rare, very rare throughout NBA history that you have like just a sole star on a title team like that. The 75 Warriors, where like rookie Jamal Wilkes is their second best player. Same thing goes for Bill Walton. Bill Walton had one of, I don't know, the 15 highest peaks in NBA history, like somewhere in the top 20. Best defender in the league, best playmaking big in the league, super efficient scorer. So these are great shouts. There's a bunch of dudes who I just think generally it happens of you're looking at the raw box score, or guys who just aren't like flashy scorers in particular, because that's what a bunch of basketball fans love and fixate on. But there's a lot of good counts. And on the flip side of that, I would say it is generally the Mellows. Dominique Wilkins, I think, is one of the most overrated players, because if you're a low efficiency scoring wing, not a plus playmaker, not a plus defender, you may be sick. You may have the Melo all-time bag post-scoring arsenal. You may have the Neek athleticism, all these flashy highlights, but it doesn't historically materialize into winning at the level that you might think with how some of these guys are talked about. So there's all my takes.
I was going to say, a few of those names kind of put some more names in my head. Like when you brought up Ray Allen, I immediately thought of Paul Pierce. I think Paul Pierce is one of the most misunderstood players ever. I think a lot of like Luka to his game. I guess you could say Luka has a lot of Pierce to his game, but like the slow, methodical change of pace driving, like I feel like
as a big physical, like 6'8" kind of forward build,
people think of Paul Pierce as like a wing, like a typical wing scorer, but in reality, like early 2000s young Pierce was like, no matter who you put in front of him, he's putting pressure on the rim. Like I think like 33% of his shots came within 3 feet of the basket in one of his peak like young seasons. But the Celtics were kind of a disaster during that time. So I feel like people think of title Pierce, not young Pierce. Like you cannot stay in front of this guy, and he's a versatile defender, blocking like a shot and a half a game. Like that dude was awesome. I think the discussion about the small point guard, high efficiency, low volume scorer, I think Chris Paul easily,
oh my God, yes,
is like one of the best players ever. Like checks every box, but just because he had some unlucky playoff injuries and stuff, it's like, yeah, he's actually a bum. I would take XX and X over him.
He's Rondo. That is the worst like false equivalency in NBA history. The CP3 Rondo stuff.
I think it's funny how Chris Paul. It's kind of funny because Steph Curry was like, in recent years, has been like the bar. Like when a point guard becomes elite, they get compared to Steph Curry. Like Damian Lillard, Luka Doncic, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Like it's always like, is he better than Steph? People forget that they were trying to do that with Chris Paul, like Darren Williams, Rondo, all of these guys, Derrick Rose. It's like, are they better than Chris Paul? And like in reality, none of them ever were. It was always Chris Paul. And I think that's really interesting. And then the last guy I want to bring up, kind of cut from the same cloth as Kevin Garnett in terms of like shortcomings as an offensive number one, but one of the GOAT defenders is David Robinson. Like people really miss on that guy, I feel like, because you look at any impact number, like box score, plus minus, team performance, like this guy stands out as a GOAT, like a GOAT player. I remember 97, he missed the entire season. They went 22-60 with the worst defense after being like 8 straight years of 60 wins. And I just think that's absurd. Like, I think David Robinson as a regular season floor raiser is like the top. Like, that guy is special.
Dude, we just had that conversation about David Robinson, like within the last 2 weeks, because I think he is fascinating. Like, and I also compared him exactly to KG, like all-time floor raiser with all-time defense, but then also enough of the offensive number one value in the regular season, at least, to where you're going to win a lot of games. You're going to be a good offense, right? Skilled mid-range shot maker, good playmaker for a big, just like one-of-one athlete in terms of his fluidity and the combination of that with size and strength. I do think he struggled even a little bit more as a playoff number one in those environments than Garnett, with better supporting cast. Not great supporting cast, but better. But they averaged 55 wins a year before Duncan got there. And every time Robinson went out, they were a disaster. Like, that sort of floor raising is very rare. And CP3 is the one other dude who I had written down, so I'm so glad that you mentioned him. Like, elite point of attack defensive guard for a long time, all-time playmaker, controls the pace of the game as well as anybody I've ever seen, runs pick and roll with the level of mastery that like probably only Nash has exceeded this century. Super efficient scorer, and in playoff environments, like CP3's been able to give you 25 whenever he wants. Like prime CP3, and also young CP3 was one of the quickest guards that we've ever seen and was a defensive monster. And his game still aged so well, even as he lost that athleticism, because then it's just like, I still have this mastery of the game intellectually, and I'm such a great mid-range shot maker. He's like a top 25 player ever for me. And I remember when we did our top 25 players, a lot of people were like, how do you have CP3 so high? CP 0 rings, Rondo 2.0. And I'm just like, man, a couple bad breaks that really aren't his fault. Like, that's the difference. That's it with his legacy.
Man, I feel like if you took someone that never watched basketball before and just showed them 2009 Chris Paul and told them that was the best player ever, they would probably like the speed, the like fierce defense where he's gonna steal the ball 3 times a game and like not make any errors. He's gonna give you 12 assists while turning the ball over once. He was like an elite transition player back then. He could get above the rim. He dunked on Dwight Howard. Like, I feel like people forget about young CP3 because they get used to like this surgical pick and roll operator where like at one point that guy was a freak, and then he just strung together one of the best longevity in professional sports we've ever seen. And it's like that totality of that career. How could you not have him in the top 20, top 25? Like, I feel like that's just insane to me.
Dude, I mean, it's amazing how one ring can completely validate or invalidate a guy's career.
Seriously.
Guys, think about Dirk Nowitzki would be here if he didn't get his ring in 2011.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the discourse around him every year, playoff choker, bum, can't get it done. You can't get over the top with Dirk. And it's like this guy was, and granted, some of this is with Steve Nash as his point guard, but this guy's churning out top 5 offenses as the lead guy every single year. So it's one ring, man. It's crazy.
Another
that
one,
one
Barkley.
championship.
Look at Barkley.
Barkley.
Oh my
talked
God,
about.
dude.
100%.
Barkley might be the biggest one, dude. Barkley might be the one. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, because I feel like it could be a hot take, but I feel like when you stack up like these all-time power forwards, I feel like Barkley was every bit as good as Dirk. Dirk definitely had like better longevity, but just talking like prime for prime. And if Dirk never won that ring, you would see those two grouped together all the time.
100%.
All that they would be like it would be like Malone, Dirk, and Barkley. Like those three are like the 3 power forwards that didn't win but were really good. And then now it's like Dirk gets pushed up, which like rightfully so, he was amazing. But like then Barkley gets shafted because he didn't win a ring, but it's like, was he supposed to win the 93 finals? Was like they weren't gonna win that.
And it's so tough because, like, that's his one shot. That's the thing with some of these guys is all of those years in Philly, very mediocre supporting cast, right? Hersey Hawkins is his second best player, like, of all of the years after 85 when it's, like, done with the Moses and Dr. J era. And those guys were old anyways while Barkley was young, so they were never going to coincide at their peaks. I'm a big Barkley over Karl Malone guy. I think he's another dude who, like, ahead of his time, his versatility as a scorer, his efficiency, he led the league in true shooting for 4 straight years. Nobody's done that since. And he did that as a 6'5" power forward. Every year it's Mitchell Robinson, Rudy Gobert, right? Just these simple rim finishers. It's unbelievable. And he did that with a level of playmaking that's totally abnormal while being like maybe the best inch for inch rebounder ever. That's probably Rodman. But like after that, it's Barkley. I don't know. He was just unbelievable offensive engine and so consistently great. But sometimes it comes down to the stuff around you. I will say, though, there is a level of greatness where you can't be denied a chip. Like Jokic, right? Like there are some dudes, like if you're Pantheon, you're just going to get it done. But even he was subjected to exactly what you're talking about, Logan. Last year was some of the most absurd discourse around an NBA superstar I've ever heard. And then it's like, some dudes just leave you without answers. You know, you can't talk shit about Jokic. You're just wrong.
What's so funny about the Barkley true shooting percentage thing is if you wanted to highlight one issue in his game offensively, it's like his shot selection.
Yeah.
So the fact that he was, I remember someone on.
It's a great point.
I don't know if you're familiar with the site Real GM, but someone on their shot charted, like I think it was 90 to 92 Barkley's paint scoring. Like every game they could find, they tracked it, and he was shooting 82% in the paint, which is higher than peak Shaq, like higher than peak Giannis. And he's 6'5". And I like how you said the whole thing about like if you're that great, you won't be denied a chip, because that immediately made me think of Hakeem Olajuwon, who had the worst situation I've ever seen from a superstar for like the first, what was it, 7-8 years of his career. It was like an absolute disaster. They bring in Rudy Tomjanovich. They implement the 4-out 1-in system, and it's like, this guy is insane, and he's putting up like 32, 15, and 5, 4 blocks, and it's like, this guy's one of the greatest I've ever seen. So I definitely think there's like a certain level, like you said. It probably starts with the guys that we talked about in that group where it was like Jokic, KG, Duncan. Like even KG, he had to get one. He just had to get one. He went to Boston, they won 67 games, 66 games, whatever it was. And it's like, I definitely think I agree with you there. It's like those guys are going to get one if they're playing 20 years.
Totally. Just too great, man. Too great to deny. Hakeem is a great example because you can look at it and say 2 rings, and it's like, well, any other player in most people's top 10, 12, whatever is going to have more than that raw number. But then it's like, you think about the circumstances, except for Wilt. Wilt will be up there with 2 rings, obviously.
And that's why, dude.
And I mean, it's 2 of the 10 most impressive individual playoff runs ever, Hakeem in 94, 95. It's unfathomable.
But people make these such pigeonholed arguments against them, too. They'll be like, oh, man, Hakeem lost in the first round 8 times. He's such a bozo. Or, you know, MJ lost. And it's like...
They were supposed to lose. Like,
they
were
exactly.
expected to win.
What do you want the guy to do, man?
It's... the modern equivalent is always there, right? It's Jokic in 2022 with Campazzo and Austin Rivers as his starting backcourt, and the narrative is, oh my God, he fails in the big moments. Draymond clamped him. He gave you the efficient 32, 11-6, whatever he normally does in a nightmarish offensive situation. Team results, man. And listen, like, your impact on team success is the most important thing. There's no question about that. But sometimes I think that we can just fail to judge that when we just look at how did your team do and not how did you individually impact your team's success and ceiling.